can move on and ask Jennifer or Tim to present their paper on stewardship and collective action, the Australian experience. And to be noted that they are heroic to be still up or already up at this time.
Thank you very much, Luca. And we're delighted to be here and, welcome everybody from the Antipodes, where we are both. So we've seen two new frontiers in the conference so far. We've seen the new frontier of systematic stewardship, and we've seen the new frontier of ESG that has now come in around the world. And I think what Marco's paper does, and I think what Tim and I are also trying to do in our paper, is to look at how we might overcome some of the disincentives and some of the hurdles to institutional investor stewardship in order to get to those new frontiers. And we're looking in both Marco's paper and in Tim and my paper at the greater leverage that institutional investors might get via collective action. And that's occurring both in Japan and in Australia. So just some background to this general stewardship debate. Coming out of the global financial crisis, I think around the world there were two very competing narratives about the role of shareholders in the global financial crisis. There was a negative narrative, which I think had, quite a lot of traction in the United States, which saw investors as instigators of the crisis. The idea that they were greedy, they were trying to push management to take greater and greater risks in order to get short-term profits. But in other jurisdictions, other common law jurisdictions, such as the UK and Australia, there was a much more positive view of the role of institutional investors in corporate governance. And in the UK in particular, the argument was, not that shareholders were pushing management for these excessive risks, but rather that they were absent, they were doing too little, and that if only the institutional investors had taken a greater role, then maybe this excessive risk-taking would not have occurred. Now, where does collective action fit within these two narratives? Well, basically, if you take the positive view, then collective action is great because it strengthens the hand of the institutional investors and allows them to have this greater role as a counterbalance to centralized managerial power. If, on the other hand, you take the negative view, then collective action is disastrous because it just exacerbates all the problems that you think already exist. And so we see that in the language that is sometimes used in relation to collective action by, say, activist hedge funds, where they're called swarms of locusts, wolf packs. This collective idea is something very dangerous. So the rise of stewardship codes that we've heard quite a bit about so far today, they come out of this very positive view of the role of institutional investors in corporate governance. And as we heard, the first of these came after the global financial crisis in 2010 in the UK, closely followed by Japan in 2014. Now, around 20 jurisdictions around the world have now adopted a stewardship code. But they can operate quite differently, particularly in Asia, which has been, very positive about stewardship codes. Many jurisdictions in Asia have adopted them, but they can operate quite differently there because some jurisdictions in Asia are much more concentrated ownership than, for example, Japan now is, and have quite few institutional investors. So I think there are three key features of these stewardship codes that are interesting to us today. The ESG aspect. Initially, these stewardship codes said virtually nothing about ESG, but that is now changing. The 2020 UK code is very strongly focused on ESG, particularly on climate change. However, other stewardship codes around the world have nowhere near that degree of emphasis. So they're not uniform in relation to ESG. Secondly, activism. To what degree are institutional investors encouraged to really escalate their engagement and engage in activism rather than simply stewardship? And once again, we see different approaches to this. And I think it's interesting after Marco's presentation, because one of the clearest differentiations is between the UK and the original Japanese model, where the UK really encouraged escalation of shareholder engagement if management wasn't listening, whereas all the emphasis in the Japanese code was on constructive dialogue, being very polite, constructive engagement, purposeful dialogue, common understandings, and that is still in the most recent iteration of the Japanese model of the code. And then finally, collective action. Some codes really stress this much more than others. I think it's stressed in the UK code much more than, for example, in the US stewardship principles. So just finally, before I hand over to Tim, why might Australia be interesting in this space? Well, I think there's a number of factors that make Australia quite interesting in relation to stewardship and in relation to collective action. One is Australian law is very influential in Asia, but as Tim will describe, Australia is an outlier when it comes to stewardship codes. We don't have a national stewardship code. We have 2 industry-related codes. Also, Australia is very favourable, I think, for institutional stewardship. It has strong shareholder rights, much stronger than, for example, mandatory rights than in Delaware. And also it has extremely high levels of institutional investor shareholding in the top companies. So Tim, over to you now. I know you've got a couple of slides, so if you want to put those up.
Thanks, Jennifer. So Jennifer's just noted how Australia has shareholder-friendly laws, and another notable feature of Australia is we have very high levels of institutional investor share ownership. Now, these conditions would seem in theory to make collective action a viable tactic for Australian institutional investors. To put it simply, in these circumstances, relatively manageable groups of institutional investors are likely to have significant combined shareholdings in public companies, which they could use to leverage their governance rights and their practical influence over their investee companies. So in our paper, we therefore set out to explore how and to what extent institutional investors use collective action in practice in Australia, and to draw some conclusions about collective action as a stewardship tactic. So our paper first considers the extent to which institutional investors engage in direct forms of collective action. And by direct forms of collective action, we're referring here to the situation where an investor with concerns about their investee company enters into an ad hoc coalition with other investors, and then that coalition then targets the company with a view to addressing the investor's concerns. Now, research which we refer to in our paper highlights that such overt forms of activism are not especially common in Australia, and to the extent that they occur, they tend to involve quite small capitalisation companies rather than the larger public companies in which institutional investors tend to focus their investments. Now, it might be suggested at this point that although institutional investors do not favour overt campaigns against their investee companies, they may instead choose to engage with their companies privately in behind-the-scenes interactions. Well, it's certainly the case that evidence indicates that it's quite common for Australian institutional investors to engage individually with companies, with their investee companies in private. However, it is much less clear whether they also form ad hoc coalitions with other investors for the purpose of leveraging their influence in such behind-the-scenes interactions. And we point out in our paper, for example, how the stewardship reports were published by large Australian institutional investors provide little indication that this is a common practice. And I should also add that since publishing our paper, one of Australia's domestic proxy advisors has told me that it's their view that Australian fund managers are reluctant to directly coordinate interventions with other fund managers for fear that in doing so, or in the course of doing so, they may divulge some advantageous trading information to other fund managers. So although ad hoc coalitions of investors may not be especially common in Australia, our research found that investors instead rely significantly on intermediary organisations to collectivise their influence in corporate governance. And just to be clear, what I'm referring to here is the situation where multiple institutional investors use or otherwise rely on an intermediary organisation to coordinate and channel their influence. And our paper describes the principal types of intermediaries that are present in the Australian market, and I've noted these on the slide. So firstly, we have industry associations. So these are organisations that asset owners, asset managers, have formed to represent their interests. Now, these associations engage actively in policy development, law reform. They have representatives on the committee that is responsible for drafting the corporate governance code that applies to Australian listed entities. These associations also often take the lead in speaking out publicly about their members' concerns regarding particular companies. And we've had a couple of notable instances of that in the last 18 months, for example, targeting the Australian and London listed resources company Rio Tinto, and targeting one of our large financial services companies over sexual discrimination in its workforce. So these associations not only deal with broader policy issues, but will target particular companies that their members are concerned about. We then have investor networks. Now, in their stewardship reports, Australian institutional investors often note that they are members of investor networks that have been formed to engage with companies about particular issues of concern. They're generally ESG issues. An example is the Investor Group on Climate Change, which supports investors engaging with Australian and New Zealand companies regarding climate change issues. It is the Australian equivalent of CERES in the North American market. We then have engagement firms. So these are service providers that assist institutional investors to undertake their behind-the-scenes engagement with investee companies. Now, these firms act for multiple institutional investor clients. They engage with those clients to work out issues of concern, and then they go and interact with companies with a view to prompting those companies to address the concerns of the clients of the engagement firms. We report in our paper that these engagement firms disclose significant levels of engagement activity on behalf of their clients, and that this level of activity is increasing year on year. And finally, proxy advisors. They are active in Australia, and we argue in our paper that they too play a role in collectivising institutional investors' influence by communicating to companies voting guidelines that will generally accord with the governance preferences of their institutional investor clients. So, why in Australia do we see market developments like this that involve institutional investors exercising their collective influence indirectly through intermediaries? Well, in our paper, we offer the following explanations. First, these intermediary organisations help to mitigate investors' coordination challenges. So rather than an individual investor having to try and bring together an ad hoc coalition of investors, these intermediaries perform this coordinating role for investors. And moreover, these intermediaries appear to be supported by a broad base of institutional investors, and this would tend to mitigate any free riding concerns that an investor may have about supporting these intermediaries. Next, these intermediaries specialise in assisting investors with governance activities. They are therefore repeat players in corporate governance, which likely means that they will accumulate knowledge and expertise, which may enable them to operate more effectively than an ad hoc coalition of investors. By using such intermediaries, institutional investors can also avoid direct confrontation with their investee companies. And that is a relevant consideration in a relatively small market like Australia. And finally, the activities of these intermediaries are generally not caught by the acting in concert rules under Australian takeover laws. So a couple of comments by way of conclusion. There's much recent literature that focuses on the various constraints that can limit the involvement of institutional investors in corporate governance. Professors Gilson and Gordon have noted, however, that market developments may arise which operate to facilitate investors' influence in corporate governance. They note the role played in this regard by hedge funds in the United States. Now, notably, hedge funds are not particularly active in Australia. However, our paper suggests that other market developments may play an analogous role, and that the types of intermediaries I've just described are an example of this. And certainly, as institutional investors seek to engage in systematic activism in relation to ESG issues, these intermediaries may be ideally placed to facilitate such systematic activism. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and Jennifer. We already have two questions from panelists. The first is from Jeff Gordon.
You know, I'm struck in hearing the account of these organizations, these coordinating organizations in both Japan, really, the paper that precedes, and Australia, by how strange this idea sounds to an American ear, in the sense that immediately everybody involved would need to file a 13D. They would become a group, because presumably the sum of them would exceed 5% of the ownership. They would then become the beneficial owner of everybody else's shares. The responsibilities of a 13D filer with respect to detailed disclosure of all the agreements, the need to update on a real-time basis changes in share ownership, quite burdensome. John Morley has written a paper suggesting why, in fact, we see the large owners in the United States, as the phrase, leading from behind, precisely because of the framework, the 13D framework, and other constraints that make group activity seem like, it's one thing to be all showing up at the same time and place, sort of, because you've got tickets to see the baseball game that you've all decided to go to on a separate way, but to actively agree in advance to show up at the meeting to vote in a certain way, and so it occurs to me that part of the reason that the hedge funds are found in the United States and not elsewhere is precisely because the funds can't coordinate directly, or they can't act concertedly to designate an agent to act on their behalf. So in effect, you have to have a third party which has its own economic motives to act, which can in effect be the center of these non-connected spokes of engagement. But again, hearing these stories of these groups of investors acting in a concerted way in both Japan and Australia is just so very different from what any general counsel of a large owner in the United States would think, is in the realm. And there's also the common ownership issue, which, I mean, the best defense that the large asset owners in the United States have is, well, we don't talk to one another. We are not acting in a concerted way, right? But here, you're consciously acting through a designated agent for all of you. And insofar as the ownership percentage is significant, then it seems to me if antitrust enforcement were an issue, you would be setting yourself up for, for the kind of agreements that an antitrust enforcer might focus on.
Jennifer, do you want to pick up the common ownership point, and I'll make a comment on the takeover point?
Yeah, sure. Just to say, Jeff, that there's been a lot of backlash in, politically in Australia, and the government is currently engaged in a couple of inquiries looking at the role of proxy advisors, but more specifically looking at whether common ownership is a real problem in Australia. And Tim and I, just a couple of weeks ago, we put in a submission on that very point. Of course, the most extreme version of common ownership, in the US, they don't have to act together. The mere holding of shares is enough to, according to some of the anti-common ownership theorists. But Tim, over to you on the takeover point.
Yeah, and certainly one of those intermediaries that I mentioned in the presentation was furiously backpedaling in front of the government inquiry to say, well, actually, this is not something of concern. We're not sort of exercising this dire influence over corporate Australia. On the takeover point, I think the critical feature in the Australian context is the interposition of the intermediary. I mean, if you just had a group of investors come together, they would get caught in a similar way by Australian takeover laws. However, the interposition of an intermediary, provided it operates in certain ways, manages to fall outside of those takeover laws.
Thank you. So there is a comment in the Q&A by David Manuel, which connects what Jeff said about acting in concert and 13D with insider trading regulation. So having an agent also protects you from the risk of being liable for insider trading. I see now Sergio, Alberto, and Giovanni who have questions. If you want to ask them one after the other, please.
Sure. Thank you, Luca, and thank you, Jennifer and team, for the great presentation. I wonder whether there are any signs that institutional investors are considering engaging with retail investors using social media and online communication strategies to reach a critical mass.
Giovanni?
Yes. First of all, I am quite in line with your papers because I think that collective action are very important and probably are becoming increasingly important in the ESG era. But I have a question that relates to the institutional investors who join these initiatives, because as you know, in Italy, we have a quite successful model of collective engagement. And what is interesting to see is that these initiatives involve both Italian and international investors. I would like to know a little bit more if also in Australia it's the same. So if also institutional investors from abroad are keen to join these initiatives.
Thank you. So Tim and Jennifer, you have 3 minutes.
Just briefly, so Sergio, no, I'm not aware of that at all. I'm not aware of the institutional investors reaching out and trying to engage with retail investors. I'm aware of sort of the converse, I guess it is, where companies, large public companies that have very large retail shareholder bases, for example, Qantas, the Australian airline, when it's had issues, for example, potential takeovers, interacting with its retail shareholder base can be pivotal to how those transactions to proceed. But I haven't yet seen institutional investors trying to do the same. Jennifer, do you want to take that second point?
Yes, on the second point, Tim mentioned a matter that we had within the last 18 months or so in Australia, the Rio Tinto matter, and that was quite interesting. Rio Tinto had done some blasting which had damaged 40,000-year-old Aboriginal site in Western Australia, and nothing happened initially. And then it was the local superannuation funds, as my understanding, and Tim can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that started getting, very hot under the collar about it. And they then brought on board the UK institutional investors. And in the end, a lot of heads rolled in that company as a result of that activism that occurred by the Australian industry funds joining the UK.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of shareholder proposals dealing with climate change issues. And they will often be filed by sort of like a social activist organisation, but they will often have support from offshore pension funds. The American pension funds tend to lend their support. And then that sort of provides those proposals with some critical mass. And then you often then see the Australian pension funds falling in behind that. So you do see that mixture of local and offshore investors in that sort of situation.
Many thanks, Tim and Jennifer, and also the participants to this Q&A session.